Well, I certainly think that's given us a lot to think about. I was excited to hear everybody, and I think nobody disappointed me in what I heard. It also, yeah. So, good job, thank you. But it also, as I was sitting there writing notes, there is a lot that we could be covering here, and I think the place that I'm interested in starting with is, Jamie gave us a very powerful images of the unmaking of place, and we then saw a great deal about the remaking of place. And the conversation that I think is the most interesting and the most difficult for me to get my arms around, and hopefully we can discuss a little bit of this, is the ability when these changes take place in communities, whether it's complete destruction or a level of disinvestment, or the infrastructure getting to the point where it is no longer viable without a major intervention. There is this displacement of people that has occurred in every single one of those situations. And as we come in and re-look at the communities, and as people re-enter the communities, I'd like to talk a bit more about the opportunity for those that remain to bring their culture and their experiences back and to integrate into that. And I think that Gina, I'd really like to actually start with you, because it came up in several places in what you discussed about bringing the neighbors' culture and talent, and the fact that you've dispersed within the community versus concentrated in the community.
I mean, I think for us, my background's in architecture and Mitch's is in studio art, but I think for anyone who, has a creative bone in their body, you sort of are drawn to places with a lot of character already. I guess the cynical side of that is that's also why the developers tend to follow the creatives, or the reality of that. But so for us, it's like, we kind of fell in love with the neighborhood, and so the last thing we would want to do is contribute to the erasure of that neighborhood, because that's why we were drawn to it in the first place. So some of it is, it's like, I guess the lingo would be community asset mapping, but for us it's just, what kind of inspires us on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the neighborhood also, we have our challenges, and there's always a drug house. It's like the whack-a-mole drug house that moves around, or there's like, a kind of steady cottage industry of prostitution in the neighborhood. But so there are these like serious social issues that also, when you're talking about a neighborhood with a lot of children and families, some change is desirable. So it's like, how do you try to create a better quality of life also for those people who often, a lot of the criminal elements in the neighborhood have lived there their entire lives. So it's like, we very much believe in that somehow those social issues have to be addressed, because moving them around doesn't actually help the community at all. You just honestly then become the target, because you might be the new kid with a laptop computer on the block, and everybody knows that. So it's this weird, crazy balancing act, and a lot of it has to do with intentions and intentionality, honestly. But for us, it's like, we're coming in as artists or practitioners who are really just looking also for affordable space to maintain our own lifestyle and our own creative practices, which is its own economic challenge. But we don't want we don't want the character to go away either. So for us, the best way to do that is to open up our practice in a way that it becomes more public. Whether that becomes like social practice or socially engaged work is totally up for debate, or there are different artists working in the neighborhood who, kind of practice in different points of that spectrum. But once we sort of scaled up the work we were doing, so once we sort of got beyond just Design 99 as a studio practice and established this not-for-profit and started accumulating more property, like it shifts into this role of responsibility. And it really, for us, becomes a question of like, what is our role in the community? What's any artist's role in a community that you're really embedding yourself in? And then once it becomes like property issues, then it becomes about what's the responsibility to that house and the houses around it and that block and then the greater neighborhood. And so it sort of just becomes like a scale issue, honestly. And so for us, it's figuring out ways to open up either those spaces and or that conversation to allow for like two-way exchanges with neighbors and residents. I mean, sometimes it's critical feedback and they tell us they don't like what we're doing, or they tell us they do like what we're doing, and like strictly aesthetic feedback. They're some of our best critics. And then part of it is moving forward. Like I'll stop after this, but there's a lot next to Squash House it's an empty lot. And we were at a neighbor's kid's birthday party this summer or this spring, and some of the boys who live in the house who are in their 20s, they're competitive badminton players, and they go elsewhere to play badminton. Then they pay to play, somewhere. There's like a facility that they go and play badminton. And they're like, we would actually really like that lot next to that house to be a badminton facility. Like we want to, instead of paying to rent somewhere else, we want to like level the ground and put down sod or astroturf and put up the net and lights, and can we have a badminton facility there, like 2 doors down from our house? And it was this like amazing, like a point of success for us, because it wasn't our idea, it was their idea. And we saw that like we were somehow, sort of unstructured and informally, but opening up a conversation where they felt comfortable, or opening up a space where they felt comfortable enough to come to us with their idea, and then we become the facilitators of their ideas.
Jamie, I mean, you've had some experience with that as well in some of these communities.
Right, and I'm very struck by what Gina was saying, and also something that Anne said. That's an image I've used many times. That it's not an exaggeration to say that a couple of people sitting on milk crates on a vacant lot drinking wine is perceived as urban blight, something we don't want in our neighborhood and our city. The same people sitting in a sidewalk cafe drinking wine and having the same conversation, would help if they're not encased in black skin, is a vision of urbanity, of what we want in our cities. I don't think there is an iota of hyperbole in that statement. And so part of what we've tried to do in our work, very much in line with what Gina was saying, is hanging out a lot, spending time in neighborhoods and really proceeding as neighbors. I personally have been inspired over the years by Central European sort of civil society strategies of resistance and organizing. So Václav Havel, Adam Michnik in Poland, during the sort of glaciated era of totalitarianism, adopted a strategy of, in this setting where citizenship is utterly degraded, what if we behaved like citizens? What if we behaved like free people? And, that led to things like writing a letter to the newspaper, holding an open meeting, monitoring the trials of dissidents, things that we would take completely for granted, that were acts of heroism in that setting. So I think about the work we do as, what would it involve to behave like a neighbor under conditions of urban apartheid? And so one of the answers is, in a setting like that vacant lot, to build a park around those guys, to actually kind of understand why that's such an appealing space to them. Is it the tree? Is it the way the world looks from there? And work with that space. And so the kind of feedback loop that Gina was talking about with a community, if you invest the time, care, attention, can lead to all sorts of interesting things. And it doesn't mean that you don't pursue your own, eccentric practice as an artist, Squash House, but Squash House leads to the badminton court, in this interesting sort of ongoing encounter.
I think, most of the communities that we work in, and most of the buildings that we work on, could benefit from investment. And, I think that the problem is that the folks who control the capital to be invested are not participants in that community. And so the challenge becomes, how do you channel that investment in a way that has integrity, and it takes the time to be patient, to understand the needs that you're trying to fill in the community you're trying to serve. And the fact is, and I'm aware of that because it's really challenging in the work that I do. I mean, I'm in Minneapolis, zooming off to 18 different cities, trying to figure out what they're trying to do. And it takes a lot to slow down, to step back, to behave like a neighbor, to not bring my solutions to the table because I've done this before. And I think that that's the challenge. The challenge is channeling investment in a way that has integrity.
And can I just respond briefly to that? That I think, again, it was something that Gina said. There's a certain kind of organizing that tries to make a virtue out of scarcity and the lack of resources. I gave a speech years ago in Harlem for the Open Society Institute titled "The Uses of Abandonment." I mean, the idea that abandonment creates what you were describing in Detroit, a degree of freedom. How that kind of work, that intensely invested on the ground work interacts with
Right.
the sort of work Greg does, there's not a natural interface there. It's hard to figure that piece out. Yeah.
Roseanne, how, when you're going into, whether these were the old, the reimagining of the flop house was actually, just fantastic to see. But when you're going in and you have a community of people that are in some of these buildings, whether it was the old residential hotels or the flop house, or now that you're working in the public housing, how do you best find, as you're looking to sort of change those places, also work with that existing community?
You need to start by taking fear off the table and reassuring people that they can root for their neighborhood, that things getting better does not mean they're getting displaced. And you can do that if you're working on a single building and you're the owner. It's complicated in a neighborhood. And one of the things I think in Brownsville, where it's the largest concentration of public housing in the country now, one of the key things that we are arguing with the New York City Housing Authority as we advance ideas about how you actually improve public housing, how you add things to the neighborhood, create a healthy mixed income community without displacement, but by adding new housing, is we believe you have to start by reassuring every one of those tenants that they're not going to be displaced, that they have guaranteed tenancy, that there aren't going to be any tricks around, going after people's income or finding ways to evict people, that you actually have to make the conditions safe for people to participate in change.
Jamie and I are chuckling here because, the truth be told, we're working together on a project in Chicago in a historic Chicago Housing Authority neighborhood, 38 acres of property. And it's been a difficult process, to say the least, at every level to make this thing move forward. And one of the things that we did, which was genius on, not my part, but other people that in my company, was recognizing this need to get on the ground. And the way we've started to do that is we went to Jamie, who has this great expertise in these communities, and said, how do we do this? And I think you might want to describe what you've been doing over the past few weeks or months.
It can be described very simply as hanging out. Really just being present, talking with people, whiling away the afternoon. But one of the and this is I'm working with an artist colleague and collaborator, and this is a very ambitious project ultimately and potentially, but starting, I think it's just so important not to jump over steps. I mean, it goes to the exchange with Greg a moment ago. And so what we find in this community that's down to 140 odd households, there's this sort of ongoing war of attrition, what Roseanne was describing, where people just live for years with uncertainty. And I think, as all of us do when we're anxious, there's a natural skew to the most negative interpretation of your circumstances. And this immense demoralization. And I don't think that this is strategic on the part of the housing authority. It's just that they can't help themselves. It's sort of bureaucratic inertia, but the impact on people, is huge. So what we're looking for, and it really is a throwback to the kind of organizing I began 20 years ago on the South Side, is just to look for small occasions to fix and repair things. They're in temporary housing. The area where they're living, it's largely a preservation project. The area where people are living is going to be demolished and redeveloped. But the pattern in Chicago, and I wouldn't be surprised elsewhere, is to have a kind of deferred maintenance, meaning that no amenities are provided, no care is given to, even if the demolition's 10 years hence, So to move in and just look for a small concrete way, a bench under the tree, a small kitchen garden. There are people a significant number of older Puerto Ricans in the development, and recently I was there, and a bunch of people on a nice day were sitting under a tree passing a guitar around. So maybe you create a little music venue, just for hanging out, for that but supporting what's there.
And I think that's really what everybody has universally talked about here is we, whether we're professional preservationists or whether we are the accidental preservationists, when we're coming into these communities and what the work is about housing and about safe places for people, that it's this engagement with the people that are there that is so critical to success, and taking preservation out of being a precious thing and making it actually a true functional part of a community that makes people want, and again, that sense of getting the fear of the new people coming in out. I think at this point we should open it up for questions from the audience. Does anybody have anything? All the way in the back.
You've described beautifully using artists to create new communities and to revitalize and to bring people together. And I'm wondering if I know of people who have moved from New York City to Costa Rica, where they are too building communities in other countries. These are retirees. These are people with reasonable level of education, reasonable level of sophistication, and they are throwing themselves into their new communities. Has this, as a group, been ever considered by you as a development group?
So you're in general talking about the senior, potential senior community.
There are many people, say 50 and over,
Right.
who may or may not consider themselves senior, but they're living and they're building communities, and they're very active. They're generally well-educated, and they contribute huge amounts. They're built to contribute, and they do things like they help in schools, they help build better health care systems, they build libraries, and this is all about community building, restoring, and I'm wondering if that group has been looked at by any of you as you look in developing your communities.
No, but it's an excellent idea. And the other group of individuals, in addition to artists, and as you suggest, maybe older adults, is returning veterans and the role they can play in community revitalization. So we're having some interesting conversations about our neighborhood work. We also are working on a similar neighborhood to Brownsville in the north end of Hartford, and speaking with the Mission Continues about, is there a role that's very intentional about other groups that can play a catalytic role in in partnering for the redevelopment of these communities.
I would respond. It's amazing how there can be stereotypes developed about who's an artist and who's not. The buildings that I've participated in the creation of art, massively age diverse, massively discipline diverse in terms of the type of art being practiced. We have formerly homeless folks, that are in our buildings. We have senior citizens in our building. We've done hospice care in our buildings. We have, infants in our buildings. And we've considered the idea of a empty nester, senior, whatever you want to call it, an age-specific project. And I just don't know why you would limit why we would limit ourselves in that way, rather than just be as inclusive as we can in terms of who we're welcoming into the community.
Another question? Yeah.
There's a lot that's really fascinating about what all of you have talked about, but the public housing thing I just find really intriguing. I mean, both the shots of in the Midwest as well, and seen a lot of that public housing. And I'm just really heartened to hear about the efforts in Brownsville and the effort to try to preserve that housing in community basis and all of that. And I don't know if you are able to say any more about how you might go about preserving the housing in the community there. And if it sounds like some of that is happening in Chicago as well, or about to. So both of you?
So we hope.
Many layers to it. Just a lot of community organizing to understand the conditions people are living in and what their ideas are for the way that the neighborhood, the urban design and the functionality of the buildings can be improved. So getting that sort of user buy-in has been a big theme in our work. Working with the Housing Authority to help really maybe with new ways of prioritizing repairs and ways of engaging residents in kind of some short-term strategies around livability. But the real thrust is, I think, a longer-term process, but to help NYCHA sort of actually be able to move forward more quickly on imagining these buildings as preservable, improvable. We are just completing a pretty interesting feasibility study with Terrapin, Bright Green, and Forsyth Street investors and landscape architects, looking at a cluster of these buildings and kind of to create a typology for how you'd actually restore checkerboard and construction of a new building, so no one would have to leave the neighborhood. Finance that using energy savings as a new contributor for the both the permanent debt and also to reduce the operating costs, and the kind of neighborhood amenities that would need to be added to increase safety and just to make life that much easier. And so in parallel to that, we are looking at adjacent privately owned buildings. I showed two of them that can be kind of supporting structures, and it's possible to move more quickly on those because you don't have the more significant kind of bureaucratic process of the public housing layers. But I guess I could have said this a lot more simply as we're looking to do a demonstration project.
So two observations in line with that. One goes back to something that Anne stressed. And I think that at least from the Chicago perspective, and Roseanne referred to the intersection of sort of mass incarceration, mental illness, public housing with your hotspot. Yeah.
Foster care.
So to go back to something that Anne talked about, changing the narrative is incredibly, incredibly important. Again, I speak out of the Chicago experience where the public housing developments where I worked and spent many, many years on the South Side were essentially criminalized spaces. I mean, that's how I got into working as much as I have on police abuse. They were allowed to function as vice zones. That's where everybody in the city bought drugs, and police sort of lived off. Those police who were abusive and predatory lived off of that dynamic. There was no conventional law enforcement, but the public perception came to be of these communities, largely communities of children, sort of being these huge bastions of criminal resistance and gangs, which really wasn't the reality. I don't want to minimize gang dynamics or the criminal economy, but there are a set of grave physical conditions on the ground, and then there are a couple of strata of hallucination on top of that, and how to correct for that while not in any way falsifying some harsh realities that need to be addressed is a really important piece of this. The second thing, which also in a way goes to the narrative, I referred to the kind of rhetorical sleight of hand of the Housing Authority, sort of like the gambling the scene in Casablanca, gambling in Casablanca. So when it comes time for a strategy of sort of reclaiming and redeveloping the central city, they declare, after years and years of utter abandonment and corruption, enough so that in the mid-90s, HUD took over the Chicago Housing Authority and put it in receivership. After years of that, they declare absolute monolithic failure. The whole thing. It's just a complete failure. Well, the reality on the ground was just a mass of discrete problems created by disinvestment, incompetence, racism, carelessness, that, were practical problems with practical solutions. And so getting down to that molecular level, as you were describing.
I kind of think the plastics equivalent in housing is management.
Oh,
Nobody
completely,
ever
yeah.
thinks about that.
Yeah.
And that's where these projects are won or lost. And,
Yeah.
I think that almost any type of housing can be good housing if it's well managed.
Agreed.
I feel like we could talk for a lot longer on this issue and maybe have an entire symposium on it. But it is actually time for us to wrap up. And we are going to take another short break. I guess Fred will talk to us about that. But I really want to thank my panel so much for your thoughts, and look forward to continuing conversations over coffee and at the reception.
I want to echo that. It was a fascinating panel. I've been thinking about what I said in the very early morning, that we aspire to be a think tank. I think we're thinking pretty interestingly right now, and I'm beginning to think about the last 4 words, the future of historic preservation is on here too. And Andrew, I think that's something you guys are going to be talking about tomorrow at the forum at Columbia as well. But we think about that all the time. I think we're all thinking about it. 50 years into, 60 years into, where are we going? Well, what I'm hearing so far, very interestingly, is maybe we're moving slightly away from bricks and toward people. So that's sort of an interesting thing for preservation to think about, from individual buildings to communities and the dignity of people in those communities and how we preserve that. So that's kind of an exciting new kind of thing to talk about, and maybe that last panel will talk about that and many other things. Anyway, enjoy your break. This is the time, again, to network. All these people from across the country are here. Talk to them.